This is another lesson in the New Testament is Fake series. My lesson is titled A Stranger's Hand. Leviticus chapter 22 to start out with. So Leviticus chapter 22 in verse 24 and 25 it reads, they're talking about the sacrifices. Ye shall not offer unto the Lord that which is bruised, or crushed, or broken, or cut, neither shall ye make any offering thereof in your land. Neither from a stranger's hand shall ye offer the bread of your God of any of these, because their corruption is in them, and blemishes be in them. They shall not be accepted by you. You can understand this strikes down the Calvary sacrifice, the coming of the 2,000-year-old Messiah when he gave his life on Calvary and resurrected. He's telling you here by Levitical law, this sacrifice shall not be accepted by you. Notice here in verse 25, it says, neither from a stranger's hand shall ye offer the bread of your God. And it is Jesus who clearly points out that he is the living bread. But the Most High is here saying, you shall not accept this. Now, as we can see, the sacrifice of this Hebrew Messiah, as I pointed out many videos ago in this series, was offered by the Romans. They were the ones who crucified him. In the time of the Torah days, the sacrifice was offered by the high priest, and it was an Israelite high priest who would offer the sacrifice. So an Israelite high priest would actually cause the death of the lamb, and in this case Jesus being the perfect lamb of God, supposedly prophesied by the Hebrew prophets, then his sacrifice should have been perfect. How does he offer up himself as a sacrifice and do a not perfect or a less perfect sacrifice than what the Hebrews did before him? And he's actually the Son of God. The Torah shows that the Hebrew priest would cause the death of the lamb. This Hebrew Messiah, his death was caused by the Romans who flogged him, whipped him and so on, caused him to bleed, drew blood, and put him up on the cross, which would be like the altar. It's like they would die on the altar, be offered up on the altar. He's dying on the cross and being offered up on the cross. Jesus died by a stranger's hand, an outsider. Now let's run over to the New Testament, to the book of Luke, chapter 22, verse 19. It reads, and he took bread and gave thanks, and brake it, and gave unto them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me. So he's telling them that his body is being offered up for them, and his body is the real bread that will feed them, spiritually, or feed them with life. So the bread they had in the Old Testament, as New Testament theology goes, was just a type or a shadow of that which was to come. Just like the Apostle Paul, who is frying in hell by now, is burning and roasting in hell for his many lies and deception. They're teaching from the New Testament that these things are just a type, but the real thing is going to come. And the Apostle Paul said, the schoolmaster, when he comes, right? So Christ is the real deal. So what they're really telling you is that the bread used in the Old Testament on these high holy days and on the Sabbath was not the real bread that Israel should consume, but they should consume a spiritual bread, which would be Christ, as the Hebrew prophets supposedly prophesied, which is all fake. But that's why I've been telling you, it is my belief that the Old Testament was written just to produce or pull off the teaching of the New Testament. It's too tightly written. And so, if the real thing is the New Testament, which is what, I mean, if the real thing is the New Testament, where even an Old Testament person or a Torah person will tell you that the bread really does symbolize the spiritual food that you're eating, so it could not be the real physical showbread that the priest would make on the Sabbath day. So that's why I'm telling you the Old Testament or the Torah was written just to produce the New Testament. The New Testament is the real deception that the Old Testament was made to pull off. Because just like the New Testament person would be corrected by the Torah person or the Torah only person, by telling the New Testament person Jesus is not that real bread, well, you're saying to the New Testament person that they are using the Old Testament bread as just a type of Jesus, and that's wrong. But the Torah only person is also using the physical bread from the temple, from the physical temple, as a type of the spiritual bread or word of God for the spiritual temple, which should be your inner person, your inner man. So, anyway, Jesus is saying here that he is the real bread, not the actual bread from the Old Testament that Moses talked about and the prophets talked about and so on. Let's go now to John chapter 6 verse 32 to 35. So it reads, Then Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, Moses gave you not that bread from heaven. So if they got the manna from heaven or the teachings and so on from heaven, but I think he's more talking about the manna here. So he's telling you no physical bread, but it also goes into meaning the teachings that they got is not complete without Jesus. But he gave you not that bread from heaven, but my Father giveth you, whereas the manna seemed to have come down from heaven, but my Father giveth you the true bread from heaven. So he's trying to say he's the true bread. For the bread of God is he which cometh down from heaven. But even the scriptures is saying you don't have to wait for anybody to go up to heaven or come down from heaven in order to give you that word, because you already got it. So that's really strange. But he says, it's he which cometh down from heaven and giveth life unto the world. That is the true bread. So he's saying he was the true bread that came down to give life, and not whatever is found in the Torah. So not the physical bread, but he is the real bread. But keep in mind now, as I said before, no stranger should be offering up, as according to Leviticus 22:25, no stranger should be offering up the bread. So if the real bread is Christ, no stranger should have been offering up the real bread on Calvary's sacrificial altar unto the Most High for the transgressions of Israel or the world. The Romans should not have been offering up Christ. Said they unto him, Lord, evermore give us this bread. And Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life that cometh to me. The bread of life, he that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. So he's saying he's real bread. Now let's go to verse 41 and 48. The Jews then murmured at him because he said, I am the bread which came down from heaven. So he's claiming to be the bread, and they heard him. Verse 48 says, I am that bread of life. That's Jesus speaking. The Hebrew Messiah says, I am the bread of life. Verse 50 and 51, this is the bread which cometh down from heaven, that a man may eat thereof and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever. And the bread that I will give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. So he's clearly showing there to the people around him that he is the true bread, and we know that he was offered up by the Romans, by a stranger's hand, the bread. But Levitical law clearly said, not even a stranger should be offering up the bread of your God, should be making the sacrifice, an offering unto the Lord. Only a Hebrew Israelite priest should do that. But the Romans are heathen by Torah standards, yet they were offering up the bread of life. So the New Testament goes against the Torah. And if the New Testament is built on the Torah, as they say, and as the Apostle Paul says that the Torah was made or written for our understanding, our learning, even though I feel differently, then basically he is ignoring all the Torah, and the whole New Testament is ignoring the Torah when they allow this Christ to be offered up unto the Most High by strangers' hand, the hands of the heathen, the Romans. The sacrifice on Calvary was done by the hands of Romans. It is wrong. It is not accepted. Because again, the text says in Leviticus 22:25, it shall not be accepted by you if it is offered up by a stranger. Now let's look at John chapter 19, verse 1 and 2. Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. Scourging means that they're whipping. And we know, we've seen the description of the whole thing, and we've seen the movies and so on. Blood is actually all over him. The crown of thorns, the whipping, with the cat of nine tails, which, as they tell us, the whip had at the end of it, it's like leather thongs, with at the end of it pieces of jagged sheep bone or pieces of metal that would just rip into his flesh, rip into his skin. So they're scourging him, whipping him, ripping up his body, damaging, ruining his body, and he's bleeding. He's a bleeding or a bloody mess. Is this a sacrifice? Did the sacrifice get mutilated like that by the high priest? Did they do that to the lamb before they offered up the lamb in the Torah days? You see, when they inflicted the death wound on the animal, they inflicted that wound to slay the animal quickly. And they would be careful because they're very skilled and trained to just slice the animal with just one cut, to kill the animal, to take the animal's life. They didn't go whipping and beating and just badgering the animal, clubbing the animal, whatever, bleeding up the animal repeatedly, like they did to Jesus for so long before he finally got the death blow, might I say, with the nails on Calvary. They beat him up bad, bloody him up, whip him up and so on, bruising him up and so on. It is just not right. Because an Israelite high priest was not doing the sacrifice, heathens, the Romans were doing it. Which shows that the New Testament is checkmated again one more time. It is destroyed again one more time. And this New Testament is fake serious. The New Testament is fake. This is real Bible teaching. So now, when it says that they scourged him, it means really they're flogging him. Just simple as that. Alright, and it goes on to mean, from this word mastix, if that's how you pronounce it, this in Greek stuff, to whip, to scourge, right? A calamity, a misfortune. And it goes on. Now, let's run over now to, well, let me finish reading verse 2 here from John chapter 19. So they scourged him, and the soldiers planted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they put on him a purple robe. So the crown of thorns would be bloodying him up even more. Now let's run back now to Leviticus chapter 22. Alright, so Leviticus 22, let's start from verse 21 and maybe 22 and 23, somewhere there. And whosoever offereth a sacrifice of peace offerings unto the Lord to accomplish his vow, or a freewill offering in beeves or sheep, it shall be perfect, to be accepted. Perfect. Now, was Jesus' body perfect? Body of a lamb being offered up by the time he got to Calvary? No. He was whipped and bruised and all that kind of stuff. But they try to make you think that the whole flogging and scourging of him and mocking was the sacrifice. When nobody did that to the animal. You didn't see people taking, in the Torah days, taking the lamb and slapping up the animal, beating up the animal, punching the animal, dragging the animal tied with some rope up along the streets of Israel, like the day or night before the morning of the sacrifice, and dragging the animal in the dirt and dirtying it up with all kinds of blood over its, and the dust and dirt and small stones, small pebbles sticking to the blood on the animals, on the lamb's bloody coat and all that kind of stuff. Kicking up the animal, bruising the animal. No, they didn't do that kind of stuff. But this is what they did to Jesus, and beat him up bad. Spit in his face and so on. And then try to offer that to God and tell you that that is a kosher sacrifice for the Hebrew Israelite salvation, or bringing together again of the two kingdoms, and for their transgressions. This is a great deception, a religious deception. So it says, a freewill offering offered up, it shall be perfect, to be accepted. So if it is not perfect, it will not be accepted. Jesus was not perfect in this way because he was battered up and bruised up and so on. Not perfect. There shall be no blemish therein. So by the time they got ready to do the real sacrifice in Calvary, because the sacrifice is about death, because sacrifice from the Hebrew means death. It means to kill. So by the time they got ready to do the actual sacrifice, because see, when they were whipping him, they weren't killing him. When they're spitting in his face, they weren't killing him. But when they were nailing him to the cross, they were killing him. That was the actual sacrifice. Because remember how they had him whipped and so on first, and Paul just wanted to stop right there, but the people were like, no, crucify him, crucify him. In other words, no, make a sacrifice out of him. Make a sacrifice out of him. Why? Because the whipping and the crown of thorns prior to that, and the spitting in his face, was not sacrifice, and the people of Israel who knew what sacrifice meant to kill, they knew that was not a sacrifice. So all that whipping and beating of him was not a sacrifice. So that part did not fulfill the sacrifice so-called prophesied by the prophets of the Torah. So the people said, no, crucify him. You might beat him up and all that kind of stuff, but that is not sacrifice. So they said, sacrifice him, or crucify him. So then finally he said, okay, I guess it has to be that way because you guys are pushing for that. So by the time they decided to do a sacrifice, he was already in bad shape, no longer perfect, and could not be accepted anymore. But they went ahead with it anyway. Why? Because this is all a deception that you're reading of in the New Testament. Moses would not have looked at this sacrificial lamb and say he is perfect and good and right to be offered up, because he was bloodied up and beaten up. Even Moses seeing him with sweats of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, Moses would be like, no. The prophets would be like, no, this isn't ready. This is not a proper sacrifice. Why? Because it shall be perfect. Blood coming out of your head is not perfection. If you see a man walking on the street with blood coming out of his head, he needs an ambulance. That's what you would say. Especially if you know he didn't just have an accident, he didn't fall, he wasn't in a fight and so on. Blood is just oozing out. You would know that this man has some problem, some medical problem, internal biological problem. Some capillaries or veins or something just bursting, rupturing in him, and blood is coming out. That man needs immediate medical attention. Needs to get to the hospital right away. His body would not be said to be in perfect or good condition. So if Moses or Isaiah, anybody would have looked at Jesus at Gethsemane with his sweats of blood coming down on him in Gethsemane, they would never say that is a perfect lamb, a ready lamb for a sacrifice for the sins, transgressions of Israel. Jesus and the New Testament is fake. He was not a proper sacrifice. He was already bleeding, so he was not perfect and could not be sacrificed by Levitical law. That's why they didn't do it in Old Testament Levitical times. They did it in New Testament deceptive times. In the fairy tale or the fairy testament written by the Romans. So it goes on, there shall be no blemish therein. Verse 22, blind or broken or maimed, or having a wen or scurvy or scabbed, ye shall not offer these unto the Lord, nor make an offering by fire of them upon the altar unto the Lord. Neither a bullock or a lamb or anything that hath any superfluous or lacking in his parts. I'm going to do another lesson on this, which I should do, record it tonight, but I'll do it some other time. Thou mayest, if he's lacking in his parts, that mayest thou offer for a free will offering, but for a vow shall not be accepted. Alright? So we talk about the master sacrifice for all of Israel here. All the transgressions ever for Israel, the way they bring it to us. So it shall not be accepted, because Jesus has to be the best sacrifice of all. He must be the purest sacrifice in every possible way. Especially since, as they teach from the New Testament, he was prepared as the sacrifice and slain from the foundation of the world. So God, according to the New Testament thinker, has already planned this thing out. The master strategist and master planner who thought of the ecosystem and the sun, the movement of the moon and the rain and everything that you see in creation, the growing of the trees, he planned out everything. It works real nice. The way your heart pumps blood, the way you know how to pass urine at a certain time, you know how to eat at a certain time. You know, everything just works well. You're going to sleep, your eyes just close on its own. Your body, everything just functions nice. So he plans out all this stuff. And you're telling me he planned out Jesus' sacrifice from eternity? But it still don't work out right in the New Testament, because he is not a perfect sacrifice by the time they put hands on him to put him on the cross and nail him, because he's already been bloody. He's a bloody mess by the time they get him. So the nails, the sacrifice, which is to kill, by killing him with the cross and the nails, he was already a bloody sight. That is not a proper sacrifice. Can you imagine bringing that to offer that before the Lord, before the Creator? Look at this bloody sacrifice. If you presented a bloody lamb that was beat up before the high priest in the Old Testament times, they'd be like, no. They would not accept that. They'd be like, go get a proper lamb, a clean lamb. That's why it even says with no blemish, because it must look pure and proper and clean. So don't offer any of that kind of stuff. So neither offer anything like that. Right? And notice here it says now, it should not be bruised or crushed or broken or cut, but they cut him and whipped him and so on, right? Neither from a stranger's hand shall ye offer the bread of your God, of any of these, because their corruption is in them. All right? So Jesus said he's the bread, the living bread that came down from heaven. The living bread, and the bread from the Old Testament, he said, is not the real bread, is not the proper bread, but he is the real bread. But the Most High says, a stranger will not offer the bread of your God in an offering, but they offered the ultimate offering on Calvary. The real bread, so-called, is being offered as an ultimate sacrifice on Calvary at the hands of strangers, who the Most High says, do not let a stranger's hand offer it up. But the Romans offered this sacrifice, the bread, the living bread of God, unto the Lord your God. The New Testament is fake.